We're going to hear now for 5 minutes each or so from each of our commenters in alphabetical order, and then we'll have some more active questions and dialogue. So, Risa, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Vicki, and thank you for your leadership and for this panel, and thank you, Ron, for those wonderful remarks. I thought for this opening piece I would problematize a couple of the major terms. So university and liberal democracy. The universities are obviously very differently situated, and we are all from very different ones. I think Vince might talk a little bit about being in a faith-based university, but what I want to talk about is I'm at the University of Virginia. The state's right there in the name. We are a public institution, and so we're in a different relationship to democracy and to the public than a private university, which I think Ron conceives of more as, part of civic society, part of the, a nonprofit organization, which is what it is. And so when I think about universities, there are large and small, public and private, faith-based and secular, global and domestic, and that's just to talk about universities. Then obviously there are community colleges and liberal arts colleges and lots of different institutions of higher education that all, I think, sit in slightly different relation to the university. The word contains multitudes. So for me, at the University of Virginia, we are part of the government. We are in a social compact with the government, and the University of Virginia was founded in the early 19th century as part of a project of building democracy and creating leaders for what was then the young democracy. I'm going to come back to that when I problematize democracy in a minute, that history. But we feel it very deeply, and I'm just curious how others think about this, right? I think of it as, intrinsic and inherent and essential to our mission that we are part of the democratic project. And I think that's true partly because we are a public university, and I think all public universities have some kind of a social compact with their chartering entities, and so that's one piece of it. And then the other piece is because of how our university was founded and for the purposes for which it was founded, which was very much to create leadership for the young United States, very much is still present in the way we think about who we are. And the universities, one of the university's highest priorities right now is supporting democracy. We're in the process of creating a new Pan-University Institute of Democracy. And at the law school, when I think about our mission, I think we have a three-part mission, and I'm curious how others of you think about your law school missions. One part is, educating students to be excellent lawyers. Another part is enabling the production of new knowledge, the discovery of new knowledge among our faculty and our students, as well as providing service. That's the third part of how I conceive of our mission. And I think the service component is partly a matter of all lawyers have a public trust and have to discharge that public trust, and part of it is that we are the University of Virginia, a public law school with a service mentality. But I think the democracy piece flows through all of that. It is about who we educate, how we educate them, the civic education portion of it, where we expect they're going to go, making sure they understand that they hold a public trust, and inculcating an understanding of their relationship to democracy there. Our faculty are producing scholarship, as Ron says, for our larger democratic project. And one piece I think that goes sort of untouted is that we law schools make possible and subsidize so much democracy work that our faculties do on commissions and serving the profession and serving society. We are always subsidizing that, and our faculties are always engaged in that in ways that I think are crucial to the democratic project. And then service, obviously, is part of that through clinics and pro bono work, and then inculcating in our students a desire for service. So that's the university piece, and I'm curious to hear how others think about, it's not that I'm saying ours is deeper or more important than yours, but I think it is slightly differently situated in ways that I feel on a regular basis in how I describe and think about our mission and in what it is the law school and the University of Virginia do. On the democracy side, Ron uses the phrase liberal democracy, which I think is important and purposeful, and we are a liberal democracy. And when I think about the founding of my law school and Thomas Jefferson, we are also an illiberal democracy and have always been, as Roger Smith, a political scientist, has said, an ascriptive democracy as well as a liberal one. So from the beginning, we had the extermination of Native Americans, we had slavery, we've had eugenics and voting restrictions and immigration exclusions, and all throughout our history, while we've aspired to a democratic promise for all, our realities have never really encompassed them, and that's certainly true at Thomas Jefferson's University, where one of the founders of our democracy was also a slave owner, and enslaved people built the university and ran the university during the time of slavery, and I think that when we ask ourselves questions, and I think this goes really, I was thinking about it, and I can't do this in my 5 minutes, but I think that fact that our aspirations have always outstripped the reality of not actually being a liberal democracy in all respects goes to all four of the things that Ron identified as the ways universities support democracy. I think most obviously it goes to the pluralism and exchange portion, but I think it goes through all of those. And the last thing I'll say before Vicki cuts me off is that I think right now, and I think we'll talk about this more in our discussion, I think right now we're in a moment where people see a real dichotomy between robust and free exchange and equality. And I actually think most of the time when people talk about this, they don't even identify that what's on the other side is equality, that people who detract from that other side call it, you know, snowflakes or offense. And I think really what's on the other side is equality. And I would say I think that caricature, that dichotomy is really overdrawn, and that equality is actually a precondition for true free exchange. So that as we think about in our law schools and we think about in our universities how to achieve the vision that I think Ron so beautifully articulated, I think we can't achieve the free and robust exchange without having a kind of equality that we've never actually achieved, and that from the beginning has infected both our democracy and our universities alike.
Larry, we'll hear from you.
Is my mic working? I guess so. So just two quick things. First, I want to thank Vicki and Ron for giving me the excuse, and Vicki for inviting me to come back here. I have not been back for 8 years since I left the university, and I would say it's great to see so many friends, except because of the bright light, I can't see any of you. But some of you, I hope, are out there. Second, I actually have some notes here, and just a very quick story. When I first became dean, Barbara Babcock, who I'm sure many people know and is like one of the very best speakers ever, came to one of my first talks as dean and came up to me afterwards and said, you know, there are two ways you can speak from notes or you can speak from the heart, and in your case, you should speak from notes. So I've always done that. So I'm going to use these. I want to actually, I don't think I really disagree with anything either Ron or Risa said, although I want to add my own glosses of a sort. So first, of course, I agree that universities play a critical role in preparing citizens for democratic citizenship, preparing students for democratic citizenship, and we can talk more about that, but I really think that is a profound given. But it's obviously different than, you know, using something like service learning to promote civic responsibility, although that's important, or, you know, knowledge of history and the Constitution's structures. That's also important, but that sort of learning should come earlier, should be provided to everyone, not just college students, and is as much a responsibility of families and communities and other institutions as it is of schools. So if we're doing that at the university, we've done something terribly wrong because it's too late. What universities do uniquely, though, is teach those who overwhelmingly become the leaders in our society, in government, in politics, in business, in civic society, basically across the board. The people who come, they're going to come through universities for their education overwhelmingly, and at a time when their values and thinking are being profoundly shaped in ways that seldom change that much after that. So what we're teaching or not teaching students today profoundly shapes what the country becomes tomorrow, and that's really the core of the responsibility. So our key responsibility then is really to prepare them for that. And that's less about any particular courses or styles of education than it is about creating a social and intellectual environment that pervasively models the values and practices that are essential for democracy. And I think that's very much what Ron was getting at. But, you know, first and foremost, to me, I think that means moving away from the current business model of the university, which emphasizes narrow specialization and career preparation is the core purpose. And you see this in things that are going to assess universities by the salary after graduation of students in so many different ways in which that message is being communicated. We need to move away from that. And then more broadly, it means fostering an environment that emphasizes values like open inquiry, embrace of diversity, willingness to listen and to be challenged. These are all the things Ron and Risa talked about, to change one's mind, critical thinking with attention to facts of evidence, and I will add the one which is willingness to compromise, which is essential for the functioning of democracy in any complex society. What's interesting to me about that, of course, is to say that's legal education. Right? That is actually, when we talk about thinking like a lawyer, that's what we're doing, but it really is something that should be pervasively part of university education, broadly speaking. And I hope we'll come back to at least some of those values and how to think about reconciling them with some of the challenges that exist to them. Because those attitudes turn out to be pretty tough to sustain, particularly with young people generally and with young people at a time like this when there's so many things causing them legitimately to feel anxiety. I have a 19-year-old daughter who is just anxious all the time for, I think, what are good reasons. But I do think it is fair to say that even in that context, we are collectively not doing an especially good job right now of fostering and sustaining that environment. Okay, so that understanding for me effectively comprises Ron's three other pillars, although in somewhat different ways. It does take in pluralism and exchange straight up. Those are among the core values and attitudes that we should be fostering. I think something similar can be said about Ron's concern for facts, although I would broaden it to say that inside the university, come back to, it's an obligation to foster a broad commitment to open inquiry, groundedness, and openness to learning through rational discourse based on evidence. So it includes something which is skepticism at the same time, right? We need to be skeptical about our own self-evident truths, and we need to foster that attitude in students. I'm going to just do one quick quote, a John Stuart Mill quote that I have always loved. Complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our own opinion is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth. And on no other terms can a being with human faculties have any rational assurance of being right. So that's a paradox, and living that paradox as a practice is difficult, but it's all the more important for us to figure out how to convey that notion. And I do agree, by the way, that in terms of the university's role outside, we need to have a better response than we have to what I think is a sometimes warranted but generally unwarranted skepticism about university research, although that's a broader issue that takes in a lot of other forces in society that are affecting things other than the university. But we do and have done a very bad job over the last 30 years, I think, universities defending their own processes, defending the legitimacy of what goes on, as well as not being sufficiently transparent. So there are two sides of that. It's not just, oh my gosh, we've been wrong and we need to be more transparent. We haven't, actually. There's a tremendous amount of good things that go on that we have not adequately defended against a 30-year attack that we have allowed without responding. And then lastly, I think it gets at social mobility, but in a way that's a little different from the one Ron suggests, which is to say, I agree, obviously, that admissions policies matter and should change as a matter of fairness, if nothing else. I think the education opportunities we provide are a public good. And so for me, you start with the notion that they should be fairly distributed. The stuff about grades and whatever it is, the ability to do well in school is a secondary concern that comes in after the fact, so that with respect to the diverse class that you create, you can give them a better environment by having fellow students who are more likely to challenge them and so on. But it's a secondary concern that should yield at all times to the primary concern, which is making sure that you're distributing this public good in a way that is fair. And to me, that's straightforward. I am very close to done. Because I think, though, at best, admissions are going to be a marginal contribution to social mobility in this country. We're just not that big. Real progress on social mobility is a matter of policy and leadership, recognition of its importance, and a willingness to deploy those values in the service of progress. That is to say, challenging market assumptions, listening to evidence about what produces social mobility, willingness to compromise in the service of it, and so on. So it comes back to the educational mission so that we send people out there who will do the things that actually can have a profound effect on social mobility.
Thank you so much, and there's so much there which we will hopefully come back to. We'll now hear from Vince.
Thanks, Vicki, and thank you, Ron, for this really rich opportunity for conversation. You've raised so many important issues, and I will try to be very focused on just one so that I can keep to my time. And what I want to think a little bit about is the university's role in promoting pluralism. And the question I want to ask is essentially a very focused one, in that how should a university, or how should the university or higher education respond to, frankly, what is a surge of identity-based right-wing populism within democratic societies? And I think what this challenge represents is a crisis or a conflict within democracy. Right-wing populism is an expression of democratic will of the people to a certain extent, but it is in direct conflict with other democratic values, also a product of the popular will, such as pluralism, and it's those values that have nurtured higher education in this country, particularly since World War II. Now, I think it's interesting, Ron, that you pointed out in your remarks that support for higher education since the 1980s has declined, and when we look in terms of the financial support offered to higher education through taxes and other public provision, and that aligns directly with an increasing diversification of the students who are being supported by by higher education. So as higher education, or as the student body became more diverse, the public will to support higher education declined. Now, there are other reasons too, but I think we need to put that into the mix. And again, this trend is flying into the face of this value of pluralism that universities and higher education more broadly have remained committed to, when in fact this value is now increasingly becoming contested in the population that we're supposedly serving. So when pluralism becomes a contested value in a democratic society, we believe, those of us in higher education, that higher education should ultimately take a side, right? We are supportive of diversity, openness. We're taking, I guess, to just use a shorthand term, a more cosmopolitan vision in the face of identitarianism and xenophobia. And that's a conflict, and there are political consequences to that, and we're going to have to reckon with those consequences. We're also making a claim that right-wing populism is inconsistent with a vision of democracy in which higher education thrives. And you spoke about educating citizens. Well, we're talking about educating citizens in a certain way, in a way that values certain things and does not, or value others, or rejects others. So I believe that if this is correct, and I believe it's correct, then we may, as universities or as members of the community of those who are in higher education, we might need to abandon some of our notions of the neutrality that we often try to claim in what we do. We're not neutral when it comes to these kinds of questions. We're saying something very specific about what democracy is supposed to be, about what education is supposed to be, and what that's supposed to mean for how we live together in community. So I think Ron's suggestions for moving forward, the ideas of supporting social mobility, ending legacy admissions, opening our research up to more scrutiny, are all right. And I think in doing that and supporting that, we're kind of putting a stake in the ground about what kind of world we want to live in. And this suggests that universities have to become less elitists and have to continue to open themselves up to the excluded and the underserved and the marginalized within society. And so if universities are going to work to bridge this gap of the gaps of wealth and inequality that are fueling not only right-wing populism, but also broader marginalization across the society and dispossession, we need to look at ourselves as participating in something new and something different, and working to bring all citizens into the activity of building a common life. So we might call this something more like inclusive populism, or a more inclusive way of understanding broader participation of citizens, and educating the citizenry to understand the importance of knowledge, expertise, diversity, inclusion, pluralism, openness and hospitality, and personal freedom that also understands a notion of collective responsibility.
Thank you very much. Let's thank our commenters, and then I'm going to... So I asked Ron if he wanted to respond. He said, no, let's get some other... I have a couple of questions for the panel, and then in a few minutes we'll invite people to come to the microphones. I'm going to sit down, I think maybe I'll stand up so people can see me. So, Larry, let me come back to something you said in your opening, which is about the values. So one thing that's interesting is no one disagreed with Ron's premise that universities and law school need to be engaged in what he called the democratic project. And you heard somewhat slightly different versions of that. So that's interesting to have that agreement on the panel. I don't know if there'll be agreement in the room. We can get questions on that later. But I thought I'd come back to something Larry said. You talked about the values necessary for democracy that universities and law schools, perhaps in particular, need to focus on, and you mentioned compromise, and if you could maybe elaborate for a minute or two, and then I'll invite anybody else in the panel to comment.
Sure. So one would be, well, there's so many ways to get at that. So think of it this way. You know, the wonder of the American Revolution and Constitution was it was actually the first successful long-term effort to create a popular government. And the insights that made that possible included recognition that you were never going to have a homogeneous society. There would always be conflict within it. And so what would it take to make this sustainable? Well, you know, this is the Madisonian solution was you expand the republic to take in more oppositional, to have lots of different passions and beliefs, and then create a process which will force people to compromise with each other in order to live together, and that there was no other way to do this, as difficult as it is. And so that notion is built into our Constitution, and it's built into, in my mind, the very concept of democracy itself. If you don't have it, the experiment will always fail. And that doesn't mean you always compromise around everything. It just means that, though, instead of jumping to assume that every disagreement is the equivalent of slavery, you recognize that on most issues we're going to try and go very far, and we reserve that sort of I'm not going to compromise on this for the few things that truly matter when there's no other choice. So it's really, as much as anything else, just a practical matter, the only way to make this work. And if we don't have that value, and you see it increasingly dying on the vine all the time, then you get where we are now, which is increasingly politics turns into a knife fight, and nobody wins.
Thanks so much. Vince or Risa or Ron, would you like to react to Larry's comment?
Ron? Oh, okay. Well, I would agree, and I would think, though, I want to reemphasize the notion that really our project as a democracy is in deep tension with what a lot of people around the world have always assumed is another way of living, which is a more tribal way, more identitarian-based way. And just look at what's going on in the UK right now. It's the English trying to lay claim to what the UK ought to be based on their sense of identity, very much in tension with, say, what the Scottish believe, which is a more cosmopolitan version of identity and more European version of identity. So there's going to always be this tension, and so we have to make some claims about what it is that we actually want to be and what direction we will go when there's a fork in the road.
Risa or Ron?
So I think. Good. This is working.
Yeah.
So I think that what's important is as we think about this value of. The gods of technology still not.
There.
Okay.
There you go.
The gods of technology aren't with me today. So I think as we coalesce around the idea that compromise is an important value for us to be inculcating within our student bodies, whether we're talking about this at an undergraduate level or in the context of law schools and professional schools more generally, the question very quickly becomes, well, how do we do things differently? And here's one of the things that I find quite striking. If you look at what takes place on our campuses in terms of a lot of these celebrated, notorious speech cases where there's been suppression of speakers and disinvitations and so forth, the truth of the matter is that these become sort of galvanizing and almost as if this is a key place where these issues are being played out. And yet when you think about how often, and I take this as an indictment of my role as university president, how often are we creating environments within the university, and I think law schools do this much better, but in the undergraduate context, where you're actually having forums where speakers from different points of view are being brought together, and you're trying to, in some sense, demonstrate to the students the capacity of taking seemingly irreconcilable values and perspectives and somehow finding a way to have civil conversation, and perhaps not consensus emerges from that, but at least a spirit of compromise. And I think that, again, this is something that we have to think about in a more intentional way within the university. How do we create more of those moments where we're tutoring students for participation in democracy in a way that they don't get as naturally as we would like?
So Risa, I was about to turn the floor over to you. You want to follow up on this discussion, but also, because I know you've thought a great deal about it, to think about how some of the issues that Ron has touched on about free speech and academic discourse in university communities and the challenges those face may have changed over time to the present.
Yep. So I think linking the kind of free speech events that are the high-profile one with how do you get to compromise is actually really important, and I think they are very much related. And I think to some extent the law is a little bit to blame here. And I think when we think about free speech, we lawyers, but not only we lawyers, we automatically go to constitutional concerns and to a constitutional right, and we think who has the legal right and who doesn't, and how do you and it becomes a trump. And I actually think we all live in communities where we speak and listen all the time, and to say that you have a right to speak doesn't actually answer the question of how you speak, when you speak, how you speak differently to different audiences, how to think about who your audience is. And I think we don't spend very much time thinking about our free speech norms that go beyond the legal entitlements, and thinking about those, I think, can get us pretty far toward, and I would say a word that hasn't come out yet, I don't think, before you get to compromise and after you have exchange is understanding, right? And I think it's very hard, and I say this from my perch in Charlottesville, Virginia, it's very hard to think that, and Vince's points about right-wing populism, it's very hard to have a free exchange of ideas if some of the speakers denigrate the very humanity of some of the listeners, right? And to say the speakers have a right under the Constitution is absolutely true. I completely embrace that. But that doesn't get you all the way to, well, how are you actually going to think about free exchange, especially in circumstances where there's relative inequality. And in terms of how it's changed, you know, I'm a historian as well as a lawyer, and so I think I'm a historian of the 60s, and there's a lot that hasn't changed, right? The generational divide that we're seeing today over these questions of who should speak, how should they speak, should they be allowed to shut down a speaker, they're not the same flashpoints, but if you look at the 60s, the university administrations thought the way these young people are speaking is counterproductive, it's squelching of free speech, it's not opening up it was exactly the same kinds of debates, I think, that were going on. And so I do think we're in a real moment of generational divide when many of us who are now, to my horror, the man, think about the entitlements differently from the young people who we are trying to educate. And I think that if we simply say, but this is the constitutional regime, or these are the values of the university, and they all tend toward exchange, academic freedom, free speech, and we don't recognize, well, once you open up the university, once you become a more diverse place, you have listeners and speakers who are differently situated vis-a-vis some speech, and if you don't take those concerns seriously, not as a matter of constitutional law, but as a matter of real norms, real academic freedom, real attempts to get to understanding and exchange, I think you don't get very far. And so I think we as people who serve the students to some extent, obviously we're both serving them and shaping them, but in order to shape them, I think we need to listen to them, and I think we need to say, you know, we see the equality concerns on the other side, and how do we get to true exchange and true understanding, actually by taking them seriously rather than not taking them seriously.
Thank you. Responses to Risa.
Yes, just a couple of quick points that tie in a lot. So first, I actually wish people would stop using the word populism. It's apart from being meaningless, it's not an accurate description. I think a better way to describe what's going on is ethno-nationalism. And it's global. And it's not just in white countries. It's not just in Western Europe. We're seeing it emerge all over the world, and it's not an unexpected response to both collapsing economic conditions and a changing global world that, creates a sense of people wanting to retreat to something. So we need to recognize that for what it is, or we're going to misdiagnose what it is we need to do. That's one. Two, I actually think it's kind of interesting if you think about lawyers, really the role of laws. Teaching understanding and then compromise is literally what we do. I mean, it always drives me nuts when people are, my kid argues all the time, they should go to law school. It's like, actually, that's the least of what lawyers do. The vast bulk of what all lawyers do, even litigators, is forge compromises, is find ways to make deals and arrangements between people who have conflicting interests. And so again, we actually have a program at the foundation of trying to get judges to go talk to legislators about how they all sit on bench with wildly different political views and manage to reach agreements and continue to work with each other going forward and try and explain to the legislators, really, it's not that hard to do this, and so on. So I think that's really important. And then lastly, again, this is just in terms of how difficult or easy it is true that we have opened up the university to some extent to a much more diverse group than was true in the past. But it is not, but that's our perception. That is to say, if you look at the time of the founding and differences that to us don't seem very big did to people at the time. So if you go to Princeton when Madison is there, you've got Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists, and those differences for them were every bit as profound as ours are today. So the problem is not new, and the question we need to be asking ourselves is, why are we doing so much less well at managing the differences that have always existed within our society? Again, this is not to minimize in any way the role, the salience, the awfulness in many ways of the kind of racism that we're trying to overcome with the diversities that we're trying to add today. But it is to recognize that it's not a completely unique problem. We do have a lot to learn from the ways in which these tensions have been managed in the past.
Ron, did you want to respond to the chain with Risa and Vincent?
Just very quickly, that in thinking about what the techniques are that we're going to be able to use to be able to shape this ideal of citizenship, I think it's important to recognize at the core we're grappling with something that is really profound and new for us in terms of the deep level of polarization in this country now that lines up, of course, around party lines. But the fact that first and foremost, we see varying different views between Democrats and Republicans on the very value of the university. That's really striking. You see increasingly a view of both Republicans and Democrats to regard the other side not as merely having a difference of opinion, but to actually have views that are injurious to the welfare of the country. So we're now impugning sort of moral motive or ill motive to the other side in the way that we didn't previously. Even things like one of the really staggering statistics that came across in some of the research I've been doing around this issue is seeing the extent to which Republicans and Democrats, more Republicans than Democrats, but still rising levels, now regard the prospect that their children will marry someone of the opposite political family is something that people regard with some revulsion. So it's in that context where we're increasingly seeing this kind of deep level of tribalism in our party politics that it makes the challenge of responding this in the university of just thinking about, a range of techniques, and even particularly ones that have been deployed well in law schools around compromise. If we don't get at some of these deep level of values that are coming into our institutions and somehow find a way to attenuate them, I think we're going to fall short. So it just undergirds the complexity of the enterprise that we're embroiled in.
Thank you. I have one other question I'm eager to ask the panel, but especially Vince, because you are the dean at would it be correct to say, religiously affiliated university? And I was intrigued by your phrase, inclusive populism, if I heard it right, and wondered how you saw the role of religiously affiliated law schools in this democratic project or in the project of inclusive populism.
Well, I think being in a religiously affiliated school gives you an opportunity and a challenge, and actually building on some of the things that Ron was talking about. I mean, a religious mission is making a truth claim about certain kinds of things. We're saying that there are certain lines about how we view the human person, for instance, that we are putting out there as what we believe in institutionally, and that's a value we're going to forward institutionally. So for instance, in the Jesuit school, we have the notion of a rigorous pursuit of knowledge and also a responsible and loving use of that knowledge that is part of our understanding of what our responsibilities are to other human beings. And so to build on Ron's point, I don't know if it's necessarily the case in our current moment that the kinds of divisions and diversities that we're trying to negotiate are just as a modified version of the ones in the 18th century, when in fact we're building off of deeply ingrained notions within the culture that certain people are less than human, or that certain people should never have been able to participate in certain kinds of conversations. We've moved beyond that, but some of that is still baked in to the culture. And so you need to be able to actually say that certain things are right or wrong, and to build off of what Risa was talking about. It goes beyond how we understand things in a legal context. It really goes into how we engage one another in a cultural sense of meaning, in a cultural context, and how the university participates in that moment. So in our institution, of course we're going to encourage wide open discussion and academic freedom, but we're also going to say that certain things are just, we don't believe are appropriate, or we believe those things are wrong. People may dispute that, and we can have that conversation, but we're at least allowing for a sense that if a choice has to be made, this is how our tradition has made that choice, and this is what we understand to be correct. And we can debate that, but it also allows us to model certain kinds of behavior institutionally and how we conduct ourselves with one another that supports this vision of what is correct or what we believe. So there's something visible about those values that I think is very helpful in trying to come to some sort of understanding of, for instance, how we should treat one another, how we should speak when we disagree, and those kinds of questions.
Thank you. Other responses to this strand?
I was just going to add one very brief thing, which I think is coming through, but I just want to say explicitly, I do think, and it's a little bit arrogant to say, given that I'm the dean of a law school, I do think the law schools are a model, not only within universities, but within society. And I think that's true. Law schools are much smaller than universities, and I think the kind of self-segregation you describe at the university at the undergraduate level isn't possible in a law school where you're in a section with people who are unlike you, possibly for the first time in your life. And I think most law schools that I know of self-consciously think about being the place where you're going to encounter people who are different from you, you're going to encounter views that are different from you, and you're going to put into place institutional structures to enhance the exchange. And I think the more we think self-consciously about that role, hopefully not in an arrogant way, but in a helpful way, the more we can say, there are all these forces that are hugely powerful, both in the upbringing of students and then in the world, that are constantly stimulating polarization, discord, a lack of ability to have exchange. But we've got to be constantly figuring out ways in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And I think every law school I know of is trying to do this. But I think it's crucial to our missions, whatever kind of law school we are, to be doing that, both for the leadership part that Larry was talking about and for the pluralism, for the whole thing. I think we are in a very unique position, and we should execute that.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed listening to this. I hope you do, but now it's your turn. And so folks who have questions or comments, please approach the mics. I think there's a mic there, and there's a second mic over here. And don't be shy. There's lots here to talk about and agree with or disagree with or ask further questions about. And I see people starting to approach, which is great. And you'll forgive me, even if I know you well, I can't see faces because of the way the lighting works. So I'm going to ask each speaker to please say slowly your name and what institution you're affiliated with. And I will start with the person on my right. And if your question is directed to a particular person on the panel, feel free to so indicate.
Thank you, Madam President. My name is Robert Ashford. I'm a professor of law at Syracuse University, and I have both a comment, I'll try to keep it short, and then a question. First of all, congratulations to you for the wonderful program, and congratulations to all the speakers that I think have done a good deal to focus on the responsibility of legal education to democracy. But one of the things that a lawyer has to do, as you all know, is to identify what is not being talked about. The other side always tries to hide what is important and not being talked about. I think we all would agree that our founders were racists, they were sexists, and they were genocidal, but they weren't stupid. One of the things that they believed, that the difference between the American experience in Europe was that democracy would not survive without widespread individual ownership of land. And that's before the Industrial Revolution. So in the 20th century, 21st century, it's capital ownership, the widespread distribution of capital ownership. I wasn't building to my question, but I do have a flyer which I'd be glad to share with everybody here.
Could I ask you to get to the question, if you wouldn't mind, because I see a bunch of people online.
I will do that. There's a flyer that says democracy, economics, democracy, and the distribution of capital ownership. Economics, democracy, and the distribution of capital ownership. So my question is, why is it that there's no focus on the distribution of capital ownership in our society? That's different from the fuzzy notion of equality. It's different from the fuzzy notion of pluralism. It's different. Those are all wonderful things. But what is it in our system that obscures the distribution of capital ownership among all of you people who understand property? So that's a question. I have an answer, but that's a question for the people.
Thank you. Panelists, Ron?
So why don't I take a stab? I mean, I think, again, the commitment, at least I have, to the enterprise of liberal democracy doesn't, of course, preclude really important discussions about what is the appropriate distribution of property, how we protect property rights, issues of income inequality, and so forth. All of those things are fair game in a liberal democracy. I think, indeed, you know, part of at least what I think I, and of course many others, Larry referred to this earlier, see as the current moment, the malaise in the current moment, is the sense that something's gone awry in terms of the significant disparities that have emerged within this country in income and wealth. So again, I think that all these things are fair game, but in the context where we believe that we're in a world where it's not end period behavior all the time, but we can negotiate these issues, have spirited discussion, and make policy change, not being in the context of an environment where we believe that there's no scope for give and take around these issues.
Risa or Larry or Vince?
I'd just say one quick thing, although that's the kind of question, you know, one, it's not the subject of this panel, actually. It was framed in a way that didn't invite that. But, I mean, I think it's unquestionably the case that some kind of relatively equal distribution of wealth is essential for the long-term health of democratic institutions. But in a democratic polity, you can only get there through those democratic institutions. So the issue, the way I see it, is first we need to at least get our democratic institutions back to minimum functionality so that we can once again have productive debates about how to achieve the kind of redistribution that we used to have or tend towards and that is necessary. So, you know, the chicken-egg issue, but one way or another, you've got to funnel it through the democratic institutions, and what are the values necessary to make those work?
Thanks very much. I'm going to move to my left and ask the first person in line to identify yourself and your institution, and general pitch to keep your questions brief in light of the fact that there are other people online. Thank you.
Hi, Alan Hornstein. Alan Hornstein, Maryland Carry Law. On the question of access and fair distribution of the good of higher education, Getting rid of legacy admissions is fine, but it seems to me difficult to talk about that without talking about the economics of higher education. I went to law school more years ago than I care to think about, and went to a public law school where my tuition was $290 a semester. My wife went to a public college in New York, a very fine college. Her tuition was $15 a semester. Those were public institutions of higher learning. Today, a graduate of a public law school winds up with $100,000 of indebtedness. It may not quite be an oxymoron to talk about tuition-driven public universities, but there's surely a tension there. And I think if what we're talking about is access, it's hard to do that without addressing that tension.
Who would like to comment on this issue that you've all thought about? I know.
Do you want to go first? So it is definitely a huge issue and something I have thought about it a lot. And at the University of Virginia Law School, we are actually financially self-sufficient, so we don't receive any funds from the university or the state, though I still take my public mission very seriously. So we do have market-based tuition, and I think the main response that I have as a dean to that is to make sure, number one, the scholarship funding has gone up enormously. So we spend quite a lot of money on scholarships, and that is clearly in response to the rising tuition. And number two, we have loan forgiveness programs that make it possible for our students to go into public service work, which I think is critically important. And number three, and I know I sit from a position of relative privilege that, you know, most of my students who want to go work in big law firms are able to do so, and they're able to service their debts because the salaries at those big law firms have become a lot greater. But I recognize that that's not always true, and I think it is a huge concern. I mean, one other thing to say about it is that the services provided by law schools today and the nature of the education is so much more resource intensive, right? I mean, the size of classes, the provision of clinics, not just the scholarship funds that we're providing to students, but the cost of education and the cost of legal education and the expectations, both by students and by the employers that we're training them for, has gone up immensely. So I think this is the million-dollar question, the $25 million question. I struggle with this all the time. I don't think we can be in a world where tuition just keeps going up and up and up, and yet I don't know that any of us have figured out an answer to stopping that problem, and so where we are is trying to mitigate the harms of that problem, and I take really seriously the mitigation of those harms and trying to ensure that the students who come to my law school are capable of graduating, are capable of passing the bar, are capable of getting jobs that will remunerate them in ways that make their debt serviceable, or that we are going to make it possible for them to go into jobs, public service jobs, or our loan forgiveness is also for underserved communities in Virginia, even if they're in private practice, to make those alternative choices. But I think that's a huge question, and I think it also ties into changes that are coming in the profession, technological and economic changes in the market, and to what extent the model of legal education that we have has to change, going forward, not only from where we've come from your time to today, but what the next 20 years look like.
Thanks. Anybody else before I go to the next question? I was there. So now I'm going to go over here. Could you please introduce yourself and your institution? And we look forward to your question.
Well, good morning. I'm Steve Shepard, and I'm at St. Mary's Law School in San Antonio, which shares the privilege of Vincent School having a religious mission and making some of these things a hell of a lot easier, because we can talk about hell and it's all right. But I have to say that as exciting as some of your calls for a greater commitment to discussion of process, compromise, inclusion is, that alone does not justify a university or a law school, and it certainly doesn't do enough for democracy. I was waiting and have so far continued to wait for anyone to talk about law and justice. Remember that one? Long ago, far away, before you went to law school, you heard about justice, and since then, nada. Oh, that's one of those San Antonio words. Nothing. But the fact is that we can talk about justice. We used to talk about justice. In that colonial curriculum of law schools, in which part of this discussion is based, justice and right and wrong were talked about all the time. They dropped out of our curriculum with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of large law firms, and the division between elite law schools who would represent defense and the others, especially small town lawyers who would represent both sides. And let me just give you a tool and ask if you're using it. Everyone knows that justice is controversial, right and wrong are controversial. We didn't used to realize, but perhaps now fact is controversial. Okay, lawyers always knew that. But it's a continuum. And you can teach tools that make it clearer, especially away from the most controversial cases that we love. And the vast majority of these cases are easy. I hate to be too controversial, but there is a very famous trial about to start in which there will be a question about whether or not the defendant engaged in, I won't say collusion, but engaged in the taking of a public good for private gain. That's the question of the trial. No one's arguing it didn't happen, at least nobody's saying. The only question is, can we obfuscate it? So what does it mean if it did happen? This is on a continuum of what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false, what is good, what is bad, what is logical, what is illogical. These continua give us the tools, and I'd like to know in your curricula, is there any place you teach it? And especially in the university level, because coming to law school, very few students have confidence that we care about right and wrong.
Thank you. Big question. Ron, you want to take the lead? And I don't know if others want to chime in.
Look, in the context, I'll let others speak to the law school setting. But at least in the context of undergraduate education, this is the argument that a number of people have made around the importance of the humanities, and to see the importance of some exposure to these core questions of justice as being an intrinsic part of what it means to be an informed citizen. And so I think that as we think about the kinds of aptitudes that we're trying to inculcate on the part of our student body, I think it's totally legitimate to ask the question of whether we ought to have if not a full curriculum, but at least places where there are mandatory courses where there are exposures to these ancient debates and questions, and see that as intrinsic to higher education and what it means to be an informed citizen. So I for one, am supportive of that. And there are clearly institutions in this country that have enshrined that within their curricula. So this is not unknown territory. It's just not widespread.
Anybody else? I've heard you talk about it.
Well, I think in the law school context, we're doing a lot around justice. There's so many different ways in which we engage that conversation across all of our schools. And just to give you a couple of quick examples, we talk a lot about, a lot of our schools have innocence projects, and we talk about the system of justice and whether or not it's providing an adequate process to really seek out the truth. And we have many examples of where it's failed, and we spend a lot of time talking about why has it failed and what structural issues are making it fail, and whether or not we understand guilt and innocence in appropriate ways. So we could go on and on about that, but the whole process of educating lawyers engages you with justice. We don't maybe always say the word, but I think we're constantly thinking about it in the context of all of the things that we're doing. And again, in certain contexts, in some kinds of institutions, it's a lot easier to make certain claims about justice, but I think everyone is doing that in the work that they do in law school.
Well, I just got to push back a little. One thing that needs to be said, look, there are easy cases and hard cases, and we focus on the hard cases throughout the education system. So we are liberal institutions, which means we do not have a script of the right answers that we're going to impose on students. We are teaching them a process of how to think and argue about that, and how to recognize that there are lots of grounds, the cases that we're going to focus on, where people can reasonably disagree about that, and how do you argue about it, and how do you come to a conclusion. So, of course, it's a pervasive part of the education, but not with some notion that there's this predetermined script for all the things that they need to do when they're out in the world, right? It's quite the opposite, and we're challenged precisely because we're dealing with the hard issues where there is real disagreement. And so I think that's central to at least the way I think about what an education system has to do.
So I see, thank you very much. I think we have 4 people still online who haven't had a chance. And so I'm going to ask those of you to try and keep your questions to the 30 to 60-second range so that you can get full responses from the panel. And I just can't help but note, I taught for 25 happy years at Georgetown Law School, and on the library there is inscribed the words, law is but the means, justice is the end, which seemed relevant to the question. Yes, would you please identify yourself and your institution?
Good morning. My name is Osamudia James. I'm at Miami Law. Like so many others, I'm interested in the debates we're having about free speech, and often when I would observe students protesting right across the country, I was thinking these students are trying to regulate a free speech market. They're trying to tilt a market that they think too easily amplifies the sort of speakers that people have been trying to disinvite or exclude from campus. You know, when they're debating about the names on buildings or the curriculum, they're trying to change that market, and they're doing work that they think administrators and leadership have abdicated. So I wanted to invite the panelists to talk with more detail about what it would look like to have a well-regulated free speech market on campus, what it would look like to actually have this sort of equality that could be a precursor to real exchange, and whether there are any circumstances in which a university or law school might say, you know what, our market is still tilted in ways that make it so that this speaker shouldn't be here, or we can't have these conversations yet, we're not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Who wants to take the lead on that one?
Nobody wants to say
Lisa.
So I haven't thought about it as regulating a market. Those aren't the words that I would use, and I don't know. I mean, I do think. I don't know that I would get to a place. So having had the Nazis come to my university, and they came without permission, right? So it was an unregulated, we didn't have any time, place, or manner policies. We had nothing in place. But I would say that the problem there was the manner in which they came rather than the fact that they were speaking. And I do feel generally, as a constitutional scholar and as the dean of a law school, we need to be open and we need to allow speakers to come. And so I don't know that I have an answer to, is there a moment where you say speakers can't come? I don't think I've seen that, and I've seen bad, right? But for me, it's not about the message, it's about the violence and the intent to commit violence, right? That's what they were doing there. But I would say that I think we can and should do a lot more to create a sense of true belonging within our own institutions, and I don't think we're there yet. So when you say, that we are still tilted in one way, I think we are all still tilted in one way. And you say, are there universities trying to untilt it? I think every university is trying to untilt it. So I think those two things are simultaneously true, and I think we are all in various ways working toward that. I mean, the number of universities that have commissions on slavery, universities are very committed as a general matter, I think, to the diversity and pluralism. And I think when we talk about what our goals are, we often talk about diversity and inclusion, and I think that is totally insufficient. So I once heard someone describe the difference between diversity and inclusion as diversity is you get invited to the dance, and inclusion is you get invited to dance. And to me, you haven't gone nearly far enough, right? Because you should be, it still assumes an insider and an outsider, and you, whoever you is, should be fully empowered and feel a sense of entitlement to decide whether there's going to be a dance or a football game or a game night or whatever it is, right? And to do that in conversation with people who are not like you, right? So I just don't think we've gotten to a place where we have a full enough sense of belonging that when a speaker comes who denigrates your humanity, you know you're part of a community that fully recognizes your humanity. And I think once we get to that place, that's what those conditions look like. And I'm happy to talk about, but I feel like I've spoken too much already, what are the institutional programs that we have at UVA that I hope are going to get us to that place. But I think we can all speak about those programs, and we all have them. But it is, just as the Democratic Project is an aspiration, the truly equal Democratic Project is an aspiration that we're still working toward.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to my right and ask you to identify yourself slowly and bear in mind the need to keep it tight.
Okay, I'm George Berman from Columbia Law School, and I want to make a suggestion which is consistent with everything that's been said. Democracy is an abstraction, and it has many, many components to it. If we believe, as I think most people in the room do, that the university has a role in protecting and fostering democracy, we might ask ourselves initially, in what way is democracy most threatened today? Because the more we understand and can articulate the threats that democracy is undergoing, the better we can fashion a university response. Now, all of us in this room have our own sense of where democracy is most frail and most at risk. Just speaking for myself, and I will, Vicki, this comment will morph very quickly into a question. I worry about the high degree of intellectual intolerance that we see in civic society today, the predominance of caricature in public discourse, the demonization that we see all around us. So I think the comment is, let's all target what it is in democracy that we think is most frail. And the question to which I turn quickly is that most of the people in this room aren't deans, and many of the prescriptions that we heard and that are entirely valid are ones that are primarily in the hands of deans. But most of us are teachers, primarily, and the question that occurred to me is, in short, how we as teachers can we, in fact, promote what it takes to defeat what I have described as the biggest threat to democracy. How can we do it without preaching, which I've just done?
Thank you.
That's my question, and I welcome any thoughts.
Thank you very much. Members of the panel, thoughts for individual faculty members. Start with Vince.
Well, I think as teachers, there are things we can do in the classroom to model a certain vision of how the discourse is supposed to happen. You could call it creating an inclusive classroom. Let's just use it as shorthand, but really thinking carefully and strategically about how we encourage all voices to rise in a classroom setting, how we sort of battle some of our own internal biases about what kinds of information we're soliciting from students, how we encourage the students to treat one another in the context of disagreement within the work we're doing around the intellectual life that we're hoping to promote in our classes and in our fields. So I think the classroom is sort of at the heart of what we're talking about here. And if you take what we're saying maybe at a higher level and just bring it back down, if those building blocks aren't in place, the work that we're trying to do institutionally can't happen.
You know what? I'm going to take what I think is the last question, and then hopefully have a little time at the end for each of you. I think he's already asked us.
No, there's a woman back there. She just sat down.
Oh, yeah. You're still, okay. Let's get the last two questions, both of you. Brief, tell us who you are, where you're from, and then I'll turn it back to the panel and we'll wind up. Great, thank you. On my left first.
Angelique Eaglewoman, Wambadia Wanwichake Washtewian. I'm Assistant Wapton Dakota, Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. I think it's interesting that we're here talking about democracy and the founding fathers of the United States without mentioning the fact that the United States is modeled on the Iroquois League. I did hear the word tribalism used, but it was used in a negative connotation, and I really think it should be used in a positive way when we talk about democracy, because it's really from American Indians that this really took root in this soil. I also want to bring up the idea that admissions are critically important at both the undergraduate and the law school level, as well as curriculum. With about 50 Indian law professors in the United States out of 11,000, we often see that law school curriculum does not include our law, and I have many non-Indian law students that don't know that there are tribal governments still in existence here, and there are 574. So I would just ask, how committed are you when you talk about representation and access and inclusion to include the indigenous peoples of this land?
Thank you. And last question.
Thanks. I'm Emily Waldman from Pace Law School. I wanted to follow up about the free speech question, and I've been thinking about it since Dean Goluboff mentioned the tension between free speech and equality, and I'm interested in your thoughts about how you manage the disputes that arise, not so much when you have something like the Nazis coming to march, but when you have speakers coming whose views really are offensive to some students, but they're also about pressing legal debates. I'm thinking about an issue we had a few years ago with someone coming to speak about transgender students, gender-neutral bathrooms, and I'm very interested in how you navigate that tension between free speech and equality. Not so much not letting the person come, but how you manage those events.
Thanks very much. Let's have just brief responses to 2 questions, and then I have a closing question that we might have time for. Who wants to go? Ron.
So why don't I just start off on the question of how we navigate these incendiary speech moments. You know, for me, it starts off with right from the get-go as part of student orientation. This is something that we did a few years ago at Hopkins in light of what we were seeing at campuses across the country. But we've really reintroduced the students, or in some cases, sadly, introduced the students to the ideals of free speech, academic freedom, why this is important, why the university is a place apart, why we have to, in some sense, air these views and bring our faculties, our skepticism to these debates, but nevertheless to hear these views. And at least for me, it's been an important prophylactic measure that the more we talk at the outset about the value of free speech and why the university, again, as I said before, is a place apart, it becomes easier in the context of specific speakers, of issues, I think, to deal with the issues in that context. And, you know, I think it's been helpful that the American Academy, by and large, after some of the really painful moments over the last couple of years when we saw speakers being shouted down on campuses where many of us thought that was inappropriate, I think we've seen a corrective for that, and I think we're more resilient around these issues than we were previously.
Any brief response to the first question?
Let's just go through it. Just
Okay. Larry, you want to?
Well, so I have to both, though. So
Yeah.
actually, I want to come back to George's question. But one of the fun things about doing history was discovering that every single thing that ever happened was overdetermined. There were more causes than you seem to need. And I think that's true for the threats to democracy today. I think you can't point to a single greatest threat. There are a number of threats, all of which are potentially fatal. Climate change is a fatal threat to democracy. I think, though, if you ask about what you can do in law schools and universities, the biggest threat is losing a sense of the importance of the idea of seeing democracy as only a means to an end and not an end that's valuable in and of itself. And political leadership models that for the citizenry, political leadership and media leadership. And so training people to go out there and emphasize that actually winning today's policy fight is not as important as preserving the institutions that make it possible for us to keep having those policy fights. Is what you guys can do. On the speech issue, to me what's interesting, I actually agree. I thought when Risa made the point about equality too, it's like, oh, that is the tough challenge here. To me, it's a lot like the first question about wealth distribution and democracy, which is to say you got a chicken-egg problem. So I actually accept the fact that there's not equality, and that without equality you can't really have this real idealized exchange that we're trying, but that I think the only way to get there is through free speech. And so we have to preserve that institution because although the students are frustrated because of the unequal power that free speech seems to give to the people that they're tired of being oppressed by. And I get that. But I don't see a better means to undo that other than through the protection of that institution.
So we've got 2 minutes, and any closing thoughts on what are the biggest threats to higher education?
Excuse me, Vicki,
And-
could someone respond to my question, please?
Oh, the native
I'm sorry?
the Native America, the indigenous
I
peoples.
think it's crucially important, and I think that I would like to know more about the Iroquois Leagues than I do. My history tends to be more 20th century, but we do teach Native American law. I think it's a crucial part of the curriculum, and I think when I'm thinking about diversity, and I know this can be a way that people are talking about it, that it is easy to hear only thinking about race if I talk mostly about slavery, but I think diversity in all different ways is crucial. I think that you raise incredibly valid points. I think you're absolutely right, and I think we need to do better, both in terms of the representation and in terms of the way we educate our students.
And we might also put it in the frame of justice, that there are many problems of justice that we have yet to remedy and that we need people to bring to our attention and push us on and try and do better. Let me go to the panel. If someone has threats to higher ed that we haven't talked about or that you want to emphasize in our last minute before I invite the audience to thank you. Ron, Larry, Ron, let's give the mic to Ron.
I think I've covered well the areas of concern that I have that, again, I think pose threats to liberal democracy. I think the only takeaway, because I thought the question you were going to ask is what is the most important threat? And for me, I think there's something about looking at the multiplicity of threats and connecting the dots. That is to say, I think we in law schools, or when I was in a law school, don't think a lot about the issues in the natural sciences around reproducibility. I think often we in law schools don't think about a lot of the issues that are going on with undergraduate education. But for those people outside the university, we're all tethered together, and I think that we've got to somehow find a forum to start connecting these dots. And then again, once we see the totality of these issues, act on them with equal urgency.
Terrific, thank you. I think we're out of time, and this is such a big organ. Let's thank the panel for a wonderful discussion.